and greetings and welcome to everyone. And in this first part of the presentation, I just propose to briefly revise the key steps in the 3 UN mechanisms that we covered in the previous course. So I'll commence with the UPR. The UPR, or Universal Periodic Review, is a relatively new procedure. It's about 15 years old, whereby each of the 193 UN member countries has its human rights record reviewed every 4 to 5 years by other UN member states. Civil society organisations, including NGOs, can make submissions as part of the UPR and then lobby sympathetic states to put forward their recommendations. NGOs can't participate directly in the process, only states can do that. So submissions must be based on first-hand knowledge of the particular human rights situation in the country, not just media reports, for example. They need to be framed in terms of human rights and to include specific, concrete recommendations about how the human rights situation can be improved. It's also important to check if the issue of concern has been the subject of recommendations in a previous review and if any progress has been made in implementation. The submissions should acknowledge the positive steps taken by government since the last review, and they should be written in a constructive rather than a critical spirit. You can always look at the submissions that ERI has made on the ERI website if you'd like to see what a submission looks like. As I mentioned previously, while NGOs can make a submission, they can't speak to it during the 3.5 hours of the actual UPR session. So about 1 month before the session, it can be good to send copies of the statement and the summary, or arrange appointments with embassies or permanent missions, as they're called here, of countries that I believe might be sympathetic or have a particular interest in the human rights that are the focus of your submission. They can be lobbied here in Geneva or in the state to be reviewed, the local embassy in your country. As the information is fed back to the capital of the country for a final decision about the recommendations to be made. The concerns raised in the submission can be explained and the country lobbied and asked to raise those concerns when they speak during the session. It's not always possible to persuade a country to put forward your issues. There are so many issues and so many groups lobbying with their particular concerns, and countries only have a very limited time for each state to speak. But we've all had some success in having our recommendations put forward and accepted by the country under review. There's also an opportunity for a limited number of NGOs to speak for 2 minutes on the outcome of the review during the formal adoption of the UPR report during the Human Rights Council session. That will be happening in a couple of weeks' time here during the Human Rights Council session that's currently taking place in Geneva. If a recommendation is accepted, the next steps are very important. There's a need to monitor how the government honours its commitments and to ensure that what is promised will actually be put into practice before the cycle begins again in 3 or 4 years' time. So that's a brief revision of the UPR. So to move on to treaty bodies, there are 9 core human rights treaties. I won't list them all, but some of them you might be familiar with: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, just to mention a few. It's up to each UN member state to agree to be bound by and ratify a treaty. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely accepted treaty, and it's been ratified by all countries in the world except the USA. The UN has then set up a committee of independent experts to monitor states' compliance with the treaties that they've committed to, and these are what we call the treaty bodies. So when a country ratifies one of these treaties, it assumes a legal obligation to implement the rights recognised in that treaty. The country also has an obligation to submit regular reports to the treaty body on how the rights are being implemented. Unfortunately, not all countries meet their obligation to report when they're scheduled to do so. The treaty bodies consider the states parties' reports, and they can also have a mechanism to consider individual complaints or communications. They also publish general comments on the content of the treaties and organise discussions on related themes. And all the treaty bodies meet in Geneva. So before engaging with treaty bodies, you need to first check that your country of concern has ratified the particular treaty you're interested in. And then when you know your country of interest is due to be reviewed, it's possible to send in a submission. The committee will study the national report and the information that comes in from NGOs, and it can issue what's called a list of issues about which it requests further information from the country to be reviewed before meeting with them. Alternatively, some committees use a streamlined system, and based on the information received from NGOs, they can ask the state under review for a list of issues prior to reporting. That just makes it easier for states to report, one report rather than two. So NGOs also have the possibility of responding to the state's report and to its response to the list of issues. But whilst they can observe, they can't take part in the discussion that takes place between committee members and the state representatives during the review in Geneva. However, it's sometimes possible to engage in informal lobbying during a break in the session. I can think of one example where, after listening to a question and answer exchange during the review, an NGO representative of one of our partners approached a member of the committee during a break and said, why don't you ask the state about X, Y, or Z, whatever it was, which was done. The concluding observations of the committee are the really important set of recommendations about how a state can better comply with the treaty. Whilst they don't have any legally binding power, they can be a very useful tool in lobbying and follow-up. So finally, a brief word on special procedures. The Human Rights Council can appoint an independent expert or special rapporteur or working group, different names for a similar thing, to examine and report on the situation in a particular country or in a particular theme. A number of them are due to report in the current Human Rights Council session, or are reporting in the current Human Rights Council session. And NGOs have an opportunity to contribute to the discussion of the report that's presented. And we're already done that with some, and we have some other statements planned. Currently, there are 45 thematic and 13 country mandates. Some examples of thematic mandates: there's a special rapporteur on the right to education, a special rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, a special rapporteur on trafficking in persons, especially women and children, and most recently, a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change has been appointed. Some of the countries where human rights concerns have resulted in the appointment of a special rapporteur include places like Afghanistan, Belarus, Burundi, North Korea, Eritrea, Myanmar, Somalia, just to name a few. NGOs can make direct contact with special rapporteurs to raise issues of concern, or request the rapporteur to make a visit to their country and engage with the special rapporteur during the visit. They can also raise awareness about recommendations made in the reports of the special rapporteur and engage in advocacy with their government about implementing the recommendations of the rapporteurs. In all of these procedures, it's important to remember the UN doesn't have the power to compel states to do anything. Plenty of states ignore or defy the international community, but states are sensitive to international opinion, and they can be open to respectful, well thought out suggestions and recommendations, and positive change is possible. So I'm now going to hand over to Budi, our first panelist from FI, and invite him to speak about his experience with the various mechanisms. Budi, I'll leave you to respond in whatever way you see fit, but perhaps you might describe what you see to be the positive features of each mechanism. Similarly, what are the limitations of each mechanism? What have you found to be the most effective ways your organisation is engaged with the various mechanisms, the UPR, treaty bodies? Have you got any suggestions or advice for people who would like to engage with treaty bodies? Can you share any of your experience of working with special procedures? And perhaps in particular might have some advice and suggestions for those who are perhaps embarking on this for the first time. So over to you, Budi.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, that Human Rights International team that has given me the opportunity to share with the participants of today on how we, Franciscans International, has been using the various mechanisms available at the UN Human Rights structure in trying to bring really the concerns of our partners and of our members at the grassroots level. And I'm happy with this discussion because we see people coming from different backgrounds. And I'm very sure that the experiences that we can share today will be a learning process, enrichment process among us. So I will speak specifically on the recent concrete examples in which we within Franciscans International has been using. So I will try to divide into several steps. First is trying to explain to you what kind of situation that we are working on and how we can bring that situations by using various UN human rights mechanism. Some of you might have known that for us in Franciscans International, we are working on the situation of the indigenous people in West Papua, Indonesia. So we've been working on this region since a very long time, and we are having direct contact with the people in West Papua through the Franciscan networks, but also through other networks. And in the last few years, there has been intensifying conflict between the pro-independent movement in West Papua with the security forces. Especially since December 2018, in which around 18 contractor workers were killed by the pro-independent movement. So that's the basic of the situations. And the response from the security forces of Indonesia were by trying to deploy more military and security forces to that regions. As a result of that security operations, many people were displaced, some people were killed, including children, including religious leaders, Protestant pastors, Catholic church workers. They were killed in the whole process. So we've been asked by our network in West Papua to advocate that situation. So that's the situation. And we are, in our community, we are thinking what kind of human rights issues that can be taken from that incidents or for that situations. And then we try to identify key human rights issues in which we can work on. So we identify the fact that there is excessive use of force by the military. There is the fact that some indigenous peoples, including women and children, were displaced. And then we've identified as well that there are cases of extrajudicial executions or extrajudicial killings by the members of the security forces. And we see as well that these West Papuan people are very distinctive because they are indigenous peoples coming from West Papua. So that is also the issue of indigenous peoples. So by identifying the key human rights issues, then we try to identify also what kind of mechanism we are trying to use to address this issue. So I can try to divide into two, as Brian has asked, using the treaty bodies as well as using the special procedures. For the treaty bodies first, as Brian has explained that since West Papua is part of Indonesia, we have to find out if Indonesia is going to be examined by the different treaty bodies. Fortunately, last year, we could identify that the Committee of CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of the Discrimination Against Women, scheduled to review Indonesia. Therefore, what we did then was having coordination discussions with our partners in West Papua, especially with the women groups, on how to raise that issue to the attention of the CEDAW committee. So we took the two steps. The first step is by submitting what we call as submission for the list of issues, as Brian has explained. So we identify key issues in which women, because Indonesia has ratified the CEDAW, how women, indigenous women in West Papua are affected by the current conflict. So we identify some key issues, and then when we write the reports, we try to link between the various articles within CEDAW with the obligations of Indonesia, what Indonesia has implemented or has done their obligation vis-a-vis of CEDAW, and then what are the gaps. And we submitted that the first submission of list of issue, and we were quite happy that finally several questions from the members of the committee were about West Papua. So that's the first step of the review, the list of issues. So we could identify several questions in which, based on our submissions, they were reflected in the first document of the CEDAW. And then in end of October last year, the review took place. As it was also explained by Brian, we tried to engage with the members of the CEDAW. There are several occasions. The first occasion is by having what we call as the initial dialogue between civil society with the members of the committee, of CIDO committee, in which the government was not there, but some representative of NGOs could speak with the members of the committee. And of course, for us, the priority is really to bring the indigenous women speaking with the members of the CIDO. And indeed, we had at least 2 indigenous Papuan women speaking about the situation of indigenous women in West Papua. And then after that, there's a second opportunity, what we call as lunch briefing, because the thing is that the whole thing was done online because of the pandemic. So we couldn't approach the experts directly. So what we did was to have what is called as lunch briefing. So it means the break during the lunchtime, in which we could have discussion with some of the committee members that were interested or that were concerned with the situation in Indonesia. And then in that discussion, again, we could have another indigenous woman to emphasize on what is the situation and what we want to be included in the recommendation of the CIDO committee as the final result. We are slightly happy and slightly disappointed with the end result, because the thing is that not many references were made with regard to the issue of West Papua. There were some references to West Papua, but there were not as many as we expected. We have analyzes it a bit, because the thing is that the rapporteur of the committee is a former diplomat coming from the neighboring country of Indonesia. So there was a kind of proximity between that member of the committee with the Indonesian government. So that was our prediction. So therefore, the explicit reference to West Papua was not as much as we expected. However, the key issues faced by the Papuan women were reflected in the general recommendations. And of course, we give it back again to our partners in West Papua that are now discussing on how to engage with the government so that those recommendations can be included. So that's one example on how we use the CIDO, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, on the situation in West Papua, as I explained earlier. The second example that I can share with you is the fact that one of the entry point we use is the issue of the displacements of the indigenous people. Thousands of them were displaced. It is estimated that since 2018 until December 2021, there were between 60,000 to 100,000 people, indigenous people, were displaced during this conflict. Then we had a discussion with our partners in West Papua, in which some of them went directly to document the situation, including writing down the names of the victims, the situations, etc., etc. So they went directly, despite the difficulties, because the access of the international community is limited. The access of the humanitarian and human rights workers are very much limited because it's considered as conflict area. However, we could find some information regarding the situation of the displaced people in West Papua. Then, through that documentation, we tried to verify it. If we don't know, we write we don't know about the situations, but allegedly we have this situation. Then, together with many other organizations, we submitted what we call as Urchin Appeal. Urchin Appeal means that we have documentation on the situations of the IDPs in West Papua, and we send it to the special rapporteur on IDPs with the expectation that the special rapporteur will write we call it as a communication. It means official letter from the UN to the Indonesian government with regard of the situation of the IDP. So we submitted that urgent appeal. And apart from that, we also organized a meeting. It was a hybrid meeting between the special rapporteur and some of us in Geneva, but as well as involving the human rights defenders from West Papua, in which we can exchange the situation. And as a result, indeed, the special rapporteur on IDPs, together with the special rapporteur on the right of indigenous people and the special rapporteur on the right of the extrajudicial execution, they wrote a very strong letter to the Indonesian government asking for explanation. So it was one of the strongest letters that was sent to the Indonesian government. What was the result? Despite the fact that the Indonesian government is not very happy with that letter, because they feel that it's a kind of a shame that the Indonesian government cannot protect their own population. But however, the result was that there was a meeting at the national level, interministerial meeting, in which the government invited people coming from different ministries, including from the security sectors, to discuss the situation. So it was a good result in which the issue was taken very seriously. And now there are some discussions within the Indonesian government on how to address the situation. Of course, the government denied that there are indigenous people in Indonesia. They denied that there are many displaced persons. But despite that denial, we feel that at the national level, there's a bit of movement in terms of trying to address, because they don't want to be ashamed at the international level. So those are key examples that we are working on. So I'm still very much in touch with the Special Rapporteur Indigenous People and trying to provide some input on how the situation has changed or has been improved in one way or the other due to that communication. So at the same time, some colleagues in Indonesia, they are also in discussion with several ministries so that we can really see how to improve the situation or how to monitor the situation so that there is a positive impact on the ground. So those are two examples, very recent examples. I'm still working on the two issues now, in which I think it's the positive, but as you can see that there are some limitations in which sometimes the government is not very happy with the fact that the UN mechanism said something critical or something that are not very good publicly at the international level. But at the same time, we feel that there are some willingness to some degree by the government really to move the situation so that the situation can improve. So back to you, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Budi. That was very, very, very helpful, very insightful. So I invite everybody to, if you had any questions that you might have for Budi, to post them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And then later in this session, Budi will have a chance to respond to them. Before moving on to our next panelist, I just add that whilst the major focus of ERI has been on the UPR, we have engaged with the treaty bodies, particularly the Committee on the Rights of the Child, where Kevin Mullen participates with Child Rights Connect, which is an umbrella organisation of NGOs that liaises with the CRC committee. And we're currently engaged with the Committee on the Rights of the Child review of Ireland and are preparing a submission about Ireland's response to the list of issues that were sent to it by the committee. And so we hope to have that submission in the coming weeks. And I just mentioned that all documents relating to the review of each state are available online via the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website. It can be tricky to navigate, but again, you can also see examples of ERI's submission to treaty bodies on our website.